This is the Soviet Union, a former oil superpower that, believe it or not, once became the second most successful economy in the world, largely because of its massive oil dominance. However, while oil is the reason why the Soviet economy was so powerful during its peak, it is also the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed in the first place. In other words, oil can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. For those of you who are not aware of the Soviets' oil dominance, the USSR was producing 12.58 million barrels of oil per day at its peak, which was about 20% of the entire world's oil supply. It had about 76 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, which was second only to Saudi Arabia. And the Soviet oil industry played a major part in global politics and economics. Oil revenues supported the Soviets' humongous military spending. Oil is an important reason why the Soviets won World War II along with the Allies. The Communist Party used oil as a geopolitical tool, and oil played a huge part during the Cold War as both the US and USSR fought for access and influence in oil-rich regions, particularly in the Middle East. The point is, oil is a crucial part of why the Soviets became such a superpower in the first place, as much as some people don't want to admit it. But, like all resource-rich countries except for Norway, oil also turned out to be a curse for the Soviet economy, and it is one of the main reasons for the regime's collapse. What's more is that by analyzing the rise and fall of the Soviet oil industry, we can learn valuable lessons for other resource-rich countries, especially how oil can become a blessing and a curse at the same time. This is the first part of a two-part series on the Soviet oil industry, and in this video, we will examine how oil became a crucial part of the Soviets' rise, and how the Soviet became an economic superpower through oil. Before you ask, no, it's not as easy as just stumbling upon oil, take it off the ground, and then became filthy rich. The Soviets actually struggled a lot early on with oil, despite having lots of it. Okay, so to start with, the Soviet oil industry was actually born not in Russia, but in Azerbaijan, in a region called Baku during the late 19th century. Back then, this city was part of an Iranian Khanate that was seized by the Russian Empire in the early 1800s. Before the Russians came, Baku actually already had an oil industry, but it was very primitive. They have 82 oil wells, all of them dug by hand, so production was very inefficient. Moreover, Baku as a region was underdeveloped. It is remote, far from any cities, let alone industrial centers, and the Tsarist government ran Baku as a part of state monopoly. Issues like corruption, nepotism, despotism were pretty common in Baku for most of the 19th century. This all changed in the 1870s though, because during that time, the Russian government saw the huge value of Baku as one of the world's richest oil regions. It's also far from a coincidence that oil started to become a valuable commodity during this period. In the mid-19th century, kerosene lamps became a crucial staple for everyone to light their homes with. In 1885, Carl Benz created the first ever automobile, and Ford Model T was launched in 1908. Which provided easy and reliable access to transportation on a massive scale for the middle class. All of these events prompted the world to begin a giant search for oil. Luckily, Russia has Baku, a region that in 1901 accounted for more than half of the world's oil production. So, Russia cleaned up its acts and did an important step that made it an oil superpower. The Russian government terminated its state monopoly and opened Baku to competing private companies. New modern oil wells were dug, instead of using inefficient hand-dug oil wells. This brought an influx of foreign capital from countries like the UK, France, Germany, and Belgium that invested not only in Baku's oil infrastructure, but also the city itself, shaping Baku to become a proper industrial center. After that, then came the entrepreneurs. For example, the Nobel brothers, in which the Nobel Prize is named from, managed the biggest private company that operated in Baku's oil fields. The Rothschilds also invested heavily in Baku's oil production. They funded railroads, oil wells, tanks, all of which helped to further advance Baku as the world's leading oil producer. And the Russian government? They just sat back and collect huge taxes on oil production while the private companies did all the dirty work. Sounds like a win-win. Now, you might think that this is it, and Russia's oil dominance continued till the fall of the Soviet Union. But that couldn't be further from reality, because from 1905 onwards, oil production in Baku actually stagnated and Russia's oil dominance pretty much ended early. For instance, between 1904 and 1913, the Russian share in the world's oil exports dropped from 31% to just 9%. Why does this happen? Well, the domestic oil extracting technology fell behind Western technologies, and this was also the time when the first Russian Revolution happened in 1905, which created all sorts of political and social instability within Russia. The next 12 years were a turbulent time for the Russian Empire, and like every city under Russian control, Baku was struggling. The oil workers, who were mostly Azerbaijanis and Armenians, received low wages, worked in harsh conditions, and faced discrimination. So, they often organized revolts and riots against their Russian and European owners. This unstable period for Russia eventually culminated in the 1917 revolution, which ended the Russian monarchy/republic and gave rise to the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet oil industry wasn't doing well either, at least initially. In fact, the Soviet oil industry faced a severe crisis in the 1930s. The oil fields in Baku had already declined significantly, the Soviet oil industry suffered from lack of investment and modernization, so it was underdeveloped and inefficient compared to countries like the USA. The USA, meanwhile, flooded the market with cheap oil, causing the Soviets' oil revenues to decrease. And not to mention, the 1930s were a time of massive purging for the Soviets. There was the 1932 to 1933 famine that killed around 5 to 8 million people, and tens of millions more deported to prison camps, including many skilled workers, scientists, and engineers. All of these factors, combined together, caused the Soviet oil industry to lose its competitiveness, unable to meet the growing domestic demand for oil, and the Soviet government even had to import oil from abroad. That might seem normal to you, but remember, this is the Soviet Union we're talking about. No wonder that around this time, Stalin was reportedly furious and he constantly criticized the poor management and performance of the Soviet oil industry. In particular, he disliked having to import oil from countries like Romania, which were prone to pressures from Western powers. So, Stalin tried to revive the Soviet oil industry through his multiple 5-year plans, and he actually succeeded remarkably. Although, you can say that most of it are due to luck. The Soviets started to modernize its equipment, especially increasing its oil refining capacity, which allows for more refined products like gasoline and diesel. They added tons of workers into the oil industry, mostly from forced labor from prisoners and exiles, to build new oil fields, pipelines, refineries, and railways for transporting oil. They also gave bonuses to workers who fulfilled their production quota and punished those who didn't, even if that punishment meant executions. All of this did help, but the most important thing that Stalin did was to encourage the search for other oil sources besides Baku. The goal was to increase the oil output and reduce the dependence on the vulnerable Baku region near the Iranian border. And the Soviet attempts to search for more oil hit the absolute jackpot here. In 1944, still during World War II, a large oil field was discovered when a wildcat entered the giant Devonian reservoir of Ternasy Field located in the Volga-Ural region, just north of Kazakhstan here on the map. Then, that was followed by the discovery of another supergiant Devonian pool of the Romashnikov Field in 1948. The Volga-Ural region turned out to be a huge blessing for the Soviets, especially as before the 1940s, the region was practically abandoned by Soviet central planners who favored it for agricultural production. During World War II, the region was used as an emergency post when drilling equipment, pipelines, and even entire refineries were disassembled and brought from Baku, which was targeted by the German invasion. So, the region became an emergency factory that produced weapons and tanks, which helped the Soviets to push back against the Germans. After the war, the Volga-Ural region then rapidly industrialized, and most of the Soviets' resources and investment went there instead of Baku. The region was the Soviets' largest oil-producing region for many years until the 1970s, until that title was handed to Western Siberia. But even today, it still produces about 20% of Russia's total oil output. And, a bit of spoiler, the production decline of the Volga-Ural region is a big part of the Soviets' eventual collapse. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the Soviet economy was known for its rapid industrialization and high growth. The Soviet economy had an annual GDP growth of 5% for 42 years long, meaning that they outperformed all countries in the 20th century except for Japan. And it grew from a poor country wrecked by famines and civil wars into a power that rivaled the United States. The Soviet oil industry contributed massively to the Soviets' growth and industrialization, in addition to strengthening its military and geopolitical power. Some highly esteemed economists even predicted that the Soviets will overtake the USA during that time, which is kind of understandable at the time, given the Soviet status as the second largest economy in the world. But that prediction couldn't turn out to be more wrong, as the Soviets later experienced a rapid decline and had all sorts of problems in pretty much every aspect of their governance, and oil played a major part in that problem. I'll publish the second part about the fall of the Soviets' oil industry soon, so stay tuned. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.